She came to Red Hollow to teach children how to read. She left that spring dance knowing she might not survive the summer. Vivian Mercer had done everything right, kept her head down, earned her place one lesson at a time, built something real in a town that never asked for her. Then Baron Crow decided she was interesting. That was all it took. One look across a crowded dance floor, and every careful thing she'd built started shaking at its foundation. And the man who stepped between them? She didn't even know his name yet. If this story moves something in you, stay until the end, hit that like button, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this reaches. Sec. The spring dance in the Red Hollow Grange Hall was the one night of the year when nobody worked. That was the deal, unspoken but understood by everyone who'd spent a winter in Wyoming. You endured 6 months of frozen earth and wind that came off the mountains like something personal. And when April finally broke and the ground softened enough to remind you it was still ground, you dressed in whatever you had that wasn't stained with labor. You walked or rode to the Grange Hall, and you danced until your legs ached and your throat was sore from laughing. For one night, the hardness of the place let up a little. Vivian Mercer had been in Red Hollow for 8 months, and she still felt like a guest. She stood near the far wall of the hall with a cup of cider she wasn't drinking, watching the room move around her. The fiddle player, a weathered old man named Cletus, who apparently had been playing at these dances since before some of the attendees were born, was working through a reel that had half the hall spinning in circles. Children chased each other between adult legs. Men she recognized as her students' fathers nodded at her when their eyes met hers, the kind of nod that was polite but not warm. Women who had been friendly enough at church and at the mercantile laughed in clusters she hadn't been invited into. 8 months, and she was still furniture. She'd known it would be like this. Her father had warned her, in his way. "They don't want teachers from Philadelphia," he'd said the last time she'd seen him, which had been under circumstances neither of them wanted to revisit. "They want teachers from somewhere they've already decided is trustworthy." She'd told him she'd earn it. He'd looked at her the way he always looked at her, like she was a problem he'd given up solving, and said nothing more. She'd earned some of it. She knew that much. The children liked her, which meant their mothers had softened some, which meant the men followed eventually, because that was how these communities worked. She'd learned to ride, badly but gamely. She'd learned to put up preserves and to pretend she didn't notice when the results were inferior to what the other women produced. She'd learned that the schoolhouse itself, a single-room building at the east edge of town, with 4 rows of desks and a leaky corner that she'd patched herself with materials she'd bought with her own money, was the thing she loved most about Red Hollow, possibly the thing she loved most, period. She was standing there thinking about the schoolhouse roof. There was another patch she'd been putting off, when she noticed that the energy in the room had changed. It was subtle. The dancing continued. The music didn't stop. But something moved through the crowd, a kind of collective awareness, the way a field of grass all bends at once when the wind shifts direction. Baron Crow had arrived. Vivian had seen him before, but never up close. He was a big man, not tall so much as wide, built like something that had been compressed over time under pressure until it became dense and immovable. He wore his money the way some men wore weapons, visibly, deliberately, so that you felt it before you understood it. His coat was better than anyone else's in the room. His boots were better. Even the way he moved through the parting crowd carried the assumption that space would be made for him. And space was made because it always had been. He was accompanied by 2 men who stood slightly behind him and slightly to either side, the way men stand when their job is to look like they're not doing a job. Vivian had been in enough difficult rooms to recognize them for what they were. She watched him work the room. That was the word for it. Work. He shook hands with the men on the school board. He said something to the mayor that made the mayor laugh too loudly. He accepted a whiskey from someone who'd apparently been waiting to offer it. All of it was performance. The performance of a man who wanted you to feel grateful for his attention while also understanding that his attention could be withdrawn. Then his eyes found Vivian. She didn't look away in time. That was her mistake. Or maybe it wasn't a mistake. Maybe she was just tired of making herself smaller, because she'd been making herself smaller in this town for 8 months and it hadn't particularly worked. He started toward her. She had approximately 12 seconds to decide what to do about it, and she spent about 10 of them standing perfectly still, cup of cider in her hand, watching him come, because there was something hypnotic about it, the way a man like that moved with complete confidence in his own trajectory. "Miss Mercer," he said. He knew her name. Of course he knew her name. "I don't believe we've been formally introduced." "We haven't," she said. "Baron Crow." He extended a hand and she shook it, because not shaking it would have been a statement she wasn't ready to make publicly. Not yet. His grip was exactly what she'd expected. Firm to the point of being slightly too firm, long enough to be slightly too long. "I've heard about the work you're doing with our children." "Our children?" "I hope what you've heard is positive," she said. "Mixed," he said pleasantly. The word landed like a stone in still water. "Some folks feel you're doing excellent work. Others have concerns about certain methods, certain ideas you might be introducing." She knew what this was. It wasn't a conversation. It was a land survey, him walking the edges of her, checking for weaknesses, for places where the fence didn't hold. "I teach reading, mathematics, history, and geography," she said. "I'm not sure which of those is the concerning part." He smiled. It was a good smile, technically. It used the right muscles and appeared at the right moments. "It's a long winter here, Miss Mercer. People talk, not always charitably." He leaned in, the small distance he closed carrying a significance that made the back of her neck prickle. "I'd hate for someone with your situation to find themselves without a position, without a place to stay." "My situation," she repeated. "A woman alone, far from home. No family connections here." He paused. "It's admirable, really, what you've tried to do. But Red Hollow can be a hard place for someone without roots." She understood him completely. She just didn't know yet what he wanted her to do about it. "Mr. Crow?" she started. "Baron," he corrected, and she couldn't tell if it was his name or a title he'd decided to bestow on himself, and she decided it didn't matter. "I appreciate your concern," she said, which was a lie, and they both knew it was a lie. "I think I'll be fine." "I'm sure you will," he said, in the tone of a man who is sure of the opposite. "I wonder, though." He reached out and took the cup of cider from her hand with a casuality that was designed to feel like violation, because it was, because the message was, "I can take things from you, and there's nothing you'll do about it. If you might save me a dance, I'd like to talk more, get to know each other properly." She was about to say something she probably shouldn't say, something that would have made the next 6 months considerably more difficult, when a voice came from her left. "She's with me." 3 words. Said quietly, without particular heat, the way you'd say the fence needs mending or looks like rain. Just a fact being presented, take it or leave it. Vivian turned. The man standing there was lean in the way that working men get lean, with hands that had clearly spent years doing things that left marks. He had dark hair going a little gray at the temples, a jaw that hadn't met a razor in a few days, and eyes that were looking at Crow with an expression Vivian could only describe as patient disagreement. He was wearing a decent shirt and clean boots, which for this crowd was about as dressed up as it got. He glanced at her, just briefly, and in that glance was something she hadn't expected, an apology. "Sorry to insert myself. You look like you might need an exit." She had never seen this man before in her life. "Calloway," Crow said. His tone had changed. Not threatened. Men like Crow didn't threaten easily, but recalculated. "Didn't know you were acquainted with our school teacher." "We manage," the man said. "She was about to give me a dance." Was she? Not a question. He looked at Vivian again, and this time there was a question in it, the real one. "Do you want me to back off? Say the word, and I will." "I don't believe I was," Vivian said, looking at Crow. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. Something passed across Crow's face. Not anger, that would come later, she suspected, in forms that were harder to read. This was something smaller and colder, the look of a man who was revising his assessment of a situation. He picked up her cider cup, which he was still holding, and set it on the nearest surface. "Another time, then," he said. He nodded at the man beside her. There was something in that nod, a message Vivian couldn't decode, and moved away, his 2 companions trailing him like debris in a current. Vivian let out a breath. "You don't have to stay near me," she said to the man who'd materialized beside her. "He's gone." "I know," he said. He wasn't watching Crow anymore. He was looking at the fiddle player. "Cletus always gets sloppy on the second reel. See how he's slowing down on the turn? Going to start dropping notes in a minute." She looked at him. He appeared to be genuinely interested in the fiddle player's technique. "I'm Vivian Mercer," she said. "I know who you are." He glanced at her. "Rhett Calloway. I run the Alderman Ranch. My hand's kids are 3 of your students." The Alderman. She'd heard of it. Good-sized operation, north of town. Old man Alderman had died 2 winters back and left the place to his nephew, who apparently didn't know ranching from a hole in the ground, which meant it was actually run by the foreman. "Thank you," she said. You were handling it," he said. She paused. "I was about to say something I'd have regretted. Probably. A hint of something that might have been a smile. Crow doesn't like to be told no directly. Takes it personally." I noticed. "You're going to want to be careful," he said. "He doesn't forget. Neither do I." He looked at her for a moment, really looked, the way people sometimes did when they were deciding how much trouble a person was going to be. Then he nodded, a small, precise movement, like a decision being made. "Can you dance?" She blinked. "What?" "Because he's watching," Rhett said, "and it would be odd if the woman I just claimed was with me refused to dance with me." She followed his gaze and found Crow across the room, in conversation with the mayor again, not looking at them, or not appearing to look at them. "I can dance," she said. "Fair warning, I'm not good at it. I'll survive." He was right. He wasn't good at it. He was stiff where he should have been, loose, and counted under his breath on the harder sequences, which she found, inexplicably, somewhat endearing. She was no expert either, her Eastern parlor education in dance not quite mapping onto the patterns the fiddle player was drawing, but they muddled through 2 songs without any serious collisions. "He wants the school property," Rhett said, while they were turned away from Crow's side of the room. She missed a step. "What?" "The schoolhouse. That lot. It's in the path of the railroad survey he's been trying to push through. He's been working the school board quietly for 3 months. He said it flatly, informatively, without drama. Nobody told me that. Nobody wanted to worry you," he said, "or nobody thought you'd stay long enough for it to matter." That landed. She let it sit. "He can't just take it," she said. "He's been filing injunctions, challenging the original land grant. He's got a lawyer in Cheyenne doing paperwork right now." They turned again. His counting had stopped, she noticed. He'd stopped thinking about the steps. "The vote is in 6 weeks." "What vote?" "School board meets in June. They're going to vote on whether to approve the sale of the land and relocate the school." He said relocate the way he might say eliminate. "There's no money to build a new schoolhouse. The board knows that." She stared at him. "You seem very informed about this." "I pay attention." A pause. "My hand's kids need that school." The song ended. They separated. The applause that followed felt like punctuation on everything he just said. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. He considered that. "Because Crow just noticed you exist," he said. "Which means in about a week some interesting stories are going to start circulating about the new school teacher, about her background, her family." He looked at her steadily. "And you're going to want to know why before it starts." She felt something go cold in her chest. Not fear, or not only fear, anger mostly. The particular anger of someone who has worked very hard to leave certain things behind and has just been told that the work doesn't matter, that the things follow regardless. "How do you know about my background?" she said. "I don't know anything about your background," he said, "but Crow will, within the week, if he doesn't already. He has people who find things." He paused. "I thought you should be ready." She looked across the room at Crow. He was laughing at something the mayor had said. The laugh reached his eyes just enough to be convincing. "Why do you care?" she asked. It was a genuine question. She was an outsider who'd been in Red Hollow 8 months and hadn't bothered to get to know the people who ran the working ranches. She'd been polite and professional and separate, because being separate felt safer than belonging to something that might reject her. Rhett Calloway thought about her question for a moment. "Because he's been running this town for too long," he said, "and everybody keeps waiting for someone else to be the one to say so first." He looked at her. "You just told him no in front of 40 people. That's a start." The week that followed was the longest of Vivian's time in Red Hollow. She went back to teaching on Monday morning as if nothing had happened, which was its own kind of discipline. 12 children in 4 age groups, reading and sums and the history of the republic they were building this territory into, She kept all of it running the way she always had, with structure and patience and the occasional raised voice when the older boys got performatively bored. But the town felt different around her now, or maybe she was just paying attention differently. She noticed things she'd been too absorbed to notice before. The way the Delacroix brothers, who ran a small cattle operation south of the river, had aged 20 years in the past 2 seasons, according to Martha Fenn, who was one of the warmer women in the church circle. The way the mercantile owner, a man named Galt, flinched when certain names came up. The way the school board members, there were 5 of them, and she only knew 3, looked at her at Sunday service with something that might have been pity or might have been guilt. Tuesday after school, Rhett Calloway came by with the excuse of checking on his middle boy, Henry, who'd been struggling with fractions. He stood outside the schoolhouse with her while the last students collected their things and headed home, and they talked about fractions for approximately 4 minutes before he got to the actual point. Crow's lawyer filed a new motion in Cheyenne yesterday, he said, claiming the original land grant for the school was improperly recorded in 1871, says the title was never properly transferred to the county. She absorbed this. Is that true? It might be true on paper, he said, which is what matters. County records from that period are a mess. There was a fire in the courthouse in '74. He rubbed the back of his neck. It's going to be hard to contest. Hard isn't impossible. He looked at her sideways. No, he said. Hard isn't impossible. She leaned against the schoolhouse door, looking at the mountains to the west, which were still carrying their winter snow at the peaks in a way that somehow seemed both permanent and precarious. She'd come to love this view, she realized. She'd come here to make herself useful, to put distance between herself and Philadelphia and everything Philadelphia contained, and she'd ended up genuinely loving this view. What does he actually want? She said. The railroad spur. If he controls the land where the school sits, he controls the junction point for the eastern approach. It's worth considerably more than he's offering. Rhett paused. He's also got a beef operation he wants to expand south. The school's eastern grazing allocation, which the county has been letting run fallow, would give him another 300 acres of usable land. So this is about land and money. It's always about land and money. And the children's education is just in the way. Yes, he said simply. She was quiet for a moment. There was a sound from inside. Henry, apparently still working through the fractions problem she'd left him, muttering to himself. She could hear his frustration. He'll come for you too, she said, if you get involved in this. He's already been making noise about the alderman's water rights, Rhett said. That started before the dance, before any of this. He looked at her. So I'm already in it. Question is whether I'm in it alone or not. It wasn't a request. It was stated plainly, offered the way you'd offer someone a choice at a fork in a road. Here are your options. Here is what each of them costs. Make your decision. She was quiet long enough that Henry came to the door and said, Miss Mercer, I think I got it. She went back inside and looked at his work. He had gotten it. The long way, with more steps than necessary. His method inelegant but ultimately correct. She told him so, and watched the satisfaction move across his face, and thought about how much a thing like that mattered. A 10-year-old boy understanding that he could figure out something difficult if he worked at it long enough, and how that was really what she was here to teach, and how she wasn't going to let it be taken. Henry, she said, as he was gathering his things, tell your father I said hello. Henry looked surprised. The relationship between the school teacher and the foreman at his ranch was not a thing he had previously considered, and said he would. Rhett was gone by the time she came back out. The story started Thursday. She first heard it from the postmaster's wife, who told it to her with an expression of theatrical concern, the kind of expression that meant she found the information very interesting and was trying to appear troubled by it. People are saying you left Philadelphia under some kind of cloud, she said, that your father had business troubles, that there was a bankruptcy, that you came west because you couldn't show your face there anymore. Vivian looked at her steadily. Good morning, Mrs. Horner. I'm just saying what people are saying. I know, Vivian said. Thank you. She took her mail and left. She stood in the street for a moment, holding the 2 letters she'd received and not reading either of them, breathing carefully. There was a particular kind of rage that came with this, with having the thing you'd tried to leave behind being used as a weapon against you, and it required careful management or it would make her say something she couldn't take back. Her father's bankruptcy, because yes, that was what it had been, a spectacular and very public collapse of his investment concern that had taken 3 other families down with it, families who had trusted him, families who had lost things they couldn't replace, was not a secret. It had been in the Philadelphia papers. It was precisely why she'd come west. Not, as the story apparently now went, because she had no choice, but because she had needed distance, had needed to be somewhere she was judged by what she did and not by who had raised her. She had wanted to be someone else's story for a while. Now she was, just not the version she'd wanted. She taught Friday's classes with complete focus, answered questions about state capitals and the mechanics of long division, read aloud from a history of the frontier that she'd ordered from a publisher in New York, and let none of it show on her face. When little Clara Delacroix asked if she was all right, she was 9 years old and alarmingly perceptive, Vivian told her she was perfectly well and handed her a slightly harder reading passage as a response to her perceptiveness. Saturday morning, she found a note on the schoolhouse door. It wasn't signed. It wasn't elegant. It said, "The board has enough votes. You'll hear by end of month. Take what's yours and go while you still can." She stood in the empty street reading it. The mountains were clear, sky sharp and blue, the kind of morning that Wyoming did better than anywhere she'd been. She folded the note precisely, put it in her pocket, and went inside and built the fire for the classroom, because it was her classroom. She was still standing at the stove, feeding wood into it, when she heard boots on the step, and Rhett Calloway knocked and opened the door. He was carrying 2 cups of coffee, which she found almost absurdly welcome. "Word travels," she said. He handed her a cup without comment. She drank. It was better coffee than she made herself. She decided not to mention it. "How many of the board votes does he have?" she said. 3 confirmed, maybe 4. There are 5 seats. He looked at the note, which she'd put on her desk. He didn't touch it. "Who left it?" "I don't know. One of the 4, probably. Or someone he hired. Doesn't matter who." She drank more coffee. Outside, a wagon was moving down the main street early for a Saturday, a farmer headed somewhere necessary. Normal life moving around this building that someone wanted to take. What would happen to the children? Officially, they'd relocate the school, build a new one somewhere. He paused. Practically, it'd take 3 to 5 years to get the funding, get the building done. By then, the older children have aged out, the younger ones have fallen behind. Some families would pull their kids to work the ranch full-time because there's no other option. He said it without melodrama, just consequences. She thought about Henry Calloway and his fractions. She thought about Clara Delacroix and her sharp eyes. She thought about the 12 children who came into this building every weekday and worked hard at things that were difficult because she'd told them it mattered, and they'd believed her. "He's not going to get it," she said. Rhett looked at her. "I need to understand the legal situation," she said. "I need to understand the original land grant, the county records, what his lawyer is actually arguing. I need to know which board members are genuinely persuadable and which ones he just has." She set down her cup. "And I need someone to tell me what other leverage he has on the ranchers around here, because it sounds like I'm not the only one he's been working on." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wagon had passed. The morning was still. "That's going to take time," he said, "and it's going to attract attention." "I know. He'll come harder." "I know that too." Another pause. She noticed he hadn't disagreed with any of it, hadn't told her she was being foolish or that she didn't understand how things worked out here. He was just sitting with it, which she appreciated. "All right," he said finally. "I've been collecting testimony from ranchers for about 2 months, documenting what he's done, who he's coerced, which deals were made under duress. I don't have enough to take to the territorial authorities yet." He looked at her. "But between that and what you might be able to do with the school board situation, it might be enough," she said, "or it makes things considerably worse." "Yes," she said. "It might do that too." He picked up her empty cup and his own and moved toward the door. Then he stopped, hand on the frame, and turned back. "About what Crow's going to say," he said. "About your father. About Philadelphia." She waited. "I don't know what happened there," he said, "and I don't need to. What I know is that you've been here 8 months, and you've done right by those kids, and that's the only thing that matters in this town." He met her eyes. "That's the only thing that's ever mattered in this town, no matter what anyone tells you." She didn't have an answer for that. She wasn't sure one was required. He left. She heard his horse on the road, moving north, back toward the alderman. She stayed in the schoolhouse for a while after, building the fire up higher than it needed to be for warmth, because the light from it was good, and she had work to do. Outside the window, Red Hollow went about its Saturday business, unaware that the fight for its future had already started, in a single-room schoolhouse with a leaky corner and a wood stove that ran hot. She rolled up her sleeves and picked up a pen. The note stayed on her desk for 3 days before she threw it in the stove. Not because she'd forgotten about it, but because she'd needed to look at it, needed to remind herself what it actually was. Not a warning from someone with power, but a warning from someone who was afraid. Men who were confident in their position didn't leave unsigned notes. They let their lawyers do the talking. The fact that someone had crept up to her door in the dark and pinned that paper to the frame told her more about the fragility of Crow's operation than any amount of public posturing could have. She burned it on a Tuesday morning, watched the paper curl and go black, and got on with her week. What she couldn't ignore quite as easily was what happened to the Delacroix family. She heard it from Martha Fenn first. She was hearing most things from Martha Fenn these days, which she wasn't sure was a reliable source, but was the source she had, that the 2 brothers who ran the Delacroix spread south of the river had received a visit from Crow's men on the previous Friday. The specifics were vague, the way specifics in a small town are always vague when people are afraid to say things plainly. There had been a conversation, there had been documents involved, there had been some kind of arrangement made that left the older Delacroix brother, a man named Forrest, sitting on his own front porch at noon on a workday, staring at the middle distance like he was trying to remember something he'd lost. Clara Delacroix came to school on Monday with a quietness that was different from her usual quietness. The girl was naturally reserved, observant, tended to process things before she said them. Traits Vivian had always respected in a 9-year-old. But this was something different. This was the particular flatness that settles over children when they have heard adult conversations they were not meant to hear and have understood more than the adults assumed. Vivian kept her after the other children left, on the pretext of reviewing her reading work, which didn't need reviewing. "Clara," she said, "is everything all right at home?" The girl considered the question with her usual seriousness. "Papa signed something," she said finally. "He and Uncle Forrest both signed. Mama cried after." Vivian kept her expression steady. "Do you know what they signed?" "I heard Papa say it was the only way to keep the water." Clara looked at her hands. "He said Mr. Crow owns the ditch now." The irrigation ditch. The Delacroix operation depended on a channel that ran off the eastern fork of the river. Without it, their summer pasture was dry ground. If Crow had acquired the rights to the ditch, he had acquired, effectively, the power to keep their cattle watered or not, depending on his mood and their cooperation. "Thank you for telling me," Vivian said. She meant it. She told Rhett that evening, meeting him at the fence line of the north pasture he'd been repairing. The kind of meeting that had become unremarkable enough in the past 2 weeks that neither of them commented on it. He listened with his hands still on the fence post he'd been setting, not looking at her, working the post back and forth to test the depth. "He got the Hendersons last month," he said. "Different method. He bought out their note from the bank in Laramie. They don't know it yet, but their mortgage holder is now a company that Crow controls." He let go of the post. "The Garrity place lost 2 sections of their east grazing lease when the county assessor, who Crow has had in his pocket for at least 2 years, reclassified the land as commercial speculation property and tripled the fee." She listened to the list. He kept it brief, but the weight of it accumulated anyway. 6 families, maybe 7, all of them tangled in arrangements they hadn't fully understood until the arrangements started being used against them. Not dramatic violence, nothing that could be taken to a marshal easily. Just the patient, legal-looking architecture of a man who understood that the most effective trap is the kind that looks like a contract. "He's been doing this for years," she said. "Since at least 1879, Rhett said. "When I first came to the alderman, most of this valley was independent operations. 15, 20 families working their own land. Now there are 7 that are genuinely clear of him in some form." He picked up his tools. including the alderman, and only because old alderman himself was stubborn enough to refuse every offer and litigious enough to make it expensive to push him. The nephew doesn't know what he inherited. What about the testimony you've been collecting? 12 statements. Most of them verbal so far. 3 written. He paused. People are scared to put it in writing, which I understand, but scared people's testimony doesn't move territorial authorities. She thought about this walking back to town in the long evening light. The mountains threw long shadows east, and the air was starting to carry the smell of real summer, grass warming up, the dry mineral scent of the rock above the tree line. She'd come to know these smells the way you come to know the sounds of a house you've lived in long enough. Not consciously, just as a feature of your life. She was thinking about the school board, specifically about the 2 members she hadn't fully assessed yet. She knew Harlan Pruitt, the chair, was in Crow's column. He was a cautious man who'd been on the board for 9 years and had learned to read the prevailing winds and face into them. She was fairly confident about James Okafor, who had a daughter in her class, and had asked her twice about the child's reading progress with the attentiveness of a man who thought education mattered. That left Dora Wicks, who ran the dry goods store, and whose position was genuinely unclear, and 2 men she'd spoken to only at Sunday service. She needed to talk to Dora Wicks. She went the next morning, before school, under the pretense of needing lamp oil. Dora Wicks was a compact woman in her 50s who had run her store alone since her husband left. Not died, left, which in this community was its own complicated fact, and who had developed the particular self-sufficiency of someone who has learned she can manage without help and would prefer not to depend on anyone anyway. She was not unfriendly to Vivian. She was not particularly friendly to anyone. "I'm not going to talk about the vote," Dora said, before Vivian had gotten past the lamp oil. "I haven't asked about the vote." "You came in here at 7:30 in the morning for lamp oil you could get after school," Dora said. "You've been here 8 months. You're not the type to run short of lamp oil accidentally." Vivian considered this. "You're right," she said. "I came to ask how you're thinking about it." "Undecided," Dora said, which was more than Vivian had expected. "Can I tell you something?" "I expect you're going to." She told her about the Delacroix ditch. She told her about the Henderson mortgage. She told her about the assessor and the Garrity land. She kept it factual, no editorializing, because Dora Wicks had the look of a woman who found editorializing annoying. She watched the woman's face while she talked, not for softening because Dora Wicks did not soften, but for the small shifts that indicated the information was landing. When she finished, Dora was quiet for a moment. She was organizing a shelf of dry goods that didn't need organizing. "If the school closes," Vivian said, "or relocates to somewhere with no building and no funding, what happens to this town in 10 years? "Children grow up without proper schooling," Dora said. "And then what? They leave, or they stay, and they're limited." Dora set down a tin of baking powder with a precision that suggested she was being careful with her hands because she was annoyed. "I'm not an idiot, Miss Mercer. I've been on this board for 4 years because I believe in public education. I'm undecided because I'm scared of what he'll do to my business if I vote against him. That's an honest answer, and I'd appreciate it if you treated it as one." "That's the most honest thing anyone in this town has said to me in 8 months, Vivian said. Something shifted in Dora's expression. Not warmth, exactly. More like recognition. 2 women who'd made the calculation that directness was more efficient than anything else. "He's going to come for you harder," Dora said. "You know that." "I know. The things about your father are true," Vivian said. "He went bankrupt. It was bad. It hurt people. I came here because I needed to be somewhere where I wasn't that story." She met Dora's eyes. "I'm asking you to vote on the school, not on my family." Dora looked at her for a long moment. Then she turned back to her shelf. "You can go," she said. "I need to open." Vivian left. She didn't know what the vote would be, but she thought she'd said the right things. She was almost at the school when she heard the sound and looked back down the main street and saw the smoke. It was coming from the eastern edge of town, in the direction of the schoolhouse. Her body understood what her mind was still catching up to, because she was already running before the thought completed itself. Not the schoolhouse, not the building, not all of it. Her skirts catching at her legs, the lamp oil she was still inexplicably carrying swinging in her hand, until she turned the corner and saw that it wasn't the schoolhouse itself that was burning. It was the woodshed attached to it, the shed that held her winter fuel supply. The fuel she hadn't had money to replace yet. The fuel she'd bought with 2 months of careful saving. By the time she reached it, 3 other people had arrived ahead of her, including Galt from the mercantile, who had a bucket, and 2 ranch hands she didn't recognize who'd been passing through. They formed the kind of inefficient bucket line that happens when strangers arrive at a crisis without coordination, and the shed burned down to its frame in about 20 minutes because the wood inside was dry and caught well, and there was nothing to be done about it. She stood watching it. The schoolhouse itself was fine. The shed was far enough separated, and the wind had been in the right direction. Her classroom, her students' desks, the bookshelf she'd built from scrap wood in December, all of it was intact. She watched the shed's frame collapse into itself and felt a cold clarity settle over her that was entirely different from the hot anger she'd expected. Galt appeared at her elbow. "I'm sorry, Miss Mercer," he said. He looked uncomfortable, which was its own information. "How did it start?" she said. "Can't say for certain. Did anyone see?" "Nobody saw anything," he said, in the tone of a man who suspects that isn't true but isn't going to say so. She nodded. She looked at the frame. There was a smell to it, a particular sharpness underneath the wood smoke that she recognized from her father's study, from the evenings he'd spent doing his accounting with the lamp turned high. Lamp oil. Not hers. Hers was still in her hand. Someone else's. She didn't say it out loud. Not here, not in front of Galt and the passing hands. She just made a note of it and put it somewhere she wouldn't lose it. Red arrived 20 minutes later, by which time the small crowd had dispersed, and she was sitting on the step of the schoolhouse with her lamp oil between her feet, writing in her notebook. "I heard about the fire," he said. "It was arson," she said. "The smell was wrong." He looked at the charred frame. He didn't argue. "Are you hurt?" "No." She kept writing. "I need a new fuel supply before October, or I can't run the school through winter. That's going to take money I don't have." She wrote the number down. "I need to know if there are people in this town willing to contribute to a fund for school resources. Not for me. For the school." He was quiet for a moment. "You want to ask the community for money while Crow's people are burning your woodshed. I want to show this community that this school belongs to them," she said. "Not to the board, not to a land grant, not to whatever Crow's lawyer filed in Cheyenne. To them." She looked up. "If they contribute to it, even small amounts, they have a stake in it they didn't have before. That changes the vote." He sat down on the step beside her, not particularly close, just occupying the available space. He looked at her notebook. Her handwriting was small and controlled, the columns of figures precise. "The aldermen will contribute," he said. "I'm not asking for charity." "I know you're not." He paused. "I'm also going to ask the ranchers whose testimonies I've collected. If they're going to be part of this fight, they should feel like they're part of this fight." A beat. "It might shake loose a few more written statements." "That was my thinking too." He looked at her sideways. "You sat down and did the arithmetic on that while your woodshed was still smoking." "I was upset," she said. "Math helps when I'm upset." Something crossed his face that wasn't quite a smile but was in that neighborhood. He looked out at the street, at the ordinary commerce of the afternoon moving past the end of the lane. A horse, a woman with a basket, a boy on an errand. "I need to tell you something," he said. The shift in his tone was small, but she caught it. She put her pen down. "I went to Cheyenne last week," he said. "Talked to a lawyer there. About the land grant documentation." He was looking at the street, not at her. "She found something." "What kind of something?" "The original 1871 grant for the school parcel. Crow's lawyers arguing it was improperly recorded." "That's true, technically. There was a clerical error in the way the surveyor's description was transcribed." He paused. "But the error doesn't invalidate the grant. It just means the description in the county records doesn't match the actual survey markers on the ground." He looked at her. "If someone went out there with the original survey and documented where the actual markers are, the physical stakes, the witness trees, whatever was left, it would establish the real property line regardless of what the county record says. Has anyone done that?" "Not since 1871. He shifted. "The lawyer in Cheyenne thinks if we can get a current survey done and filed before the board vote, it undermines Crow's legal argument significantly, maybe completely." She absorbed this. "How much does a survey cost?" He named a number. It was more than the woodshed had been, and less than what she had. The alderman would cover it, he said, before she could respond. Rhett, it's not charity, he said, with the same inflection she'd used. If the school loses that land, the railroad spur goes through the East Valley access. That puts Crow's freight operation between the alderman and the river crossing. He looked at her steadily. I have a financial interest in this. Don't make it sentimental. She held his gaze for a moment. He was not a man who performed emotions he didn't have, and he was not performing now. He was making a practical argument. It happened to be a practical argument that also required him to trust her and to spend money he couldn't entirely afford on a fight that might not be winnable, but he was presenting it as arithmetic, and she would let him do that. All right, she said. When can the surveyor come? End of the week, if I send a telegram tonight. Send it. She picked up her pen again. He stayed on the step for a while, not talking, while she worked through her figures. The afternoon light moved across the charred frame of her former woodshed, catching the edges of things, making the destruction look almost geometrically deliberate, which of course it had been. It was Henry who found the second note 4 days later. He came in early on a Thursday, which was unusual for him. He was reliably exactly on time, not a minute before, and he had the look of someone carrying something he'd picked up without wanting it. He held out a folded piece of paper. It was in my lunch pail, he said. I didn't put it there. She unfolded it. This one wasn't addressed to her. It was addressed to Rhett, written in the same hand as the first. It said, Tell your foreman what happens to men who side with outsiders. Ask him about the Whitmore Range, 1879. She read it twice. Then she folded it and put it in her pocket. Thank you, Henry. Take your seat. She taught the morning session with the same consistency she always maintained in front of the children. Fractions for the middle group, a geography lesson for the older students, reading practice for the 3 youngest. She answered questions. She corrected errors without cruelty. She did not think about the note in her pocket. At noon, she walked to the alderman. It was a longer walk than she usually took at midday, 4 miles on a road that was honest about being a road, not a path that had aspirations. She arrived at the ranch yard warm from the walk and mildly irritated at herself for not having brought water. Rhett was in the yard working with a young horse, a bay that hadn't decided yet whether to accept a bridle or not, and he didn't stop when he saw her coming, just kept his attention on the horse, which she understood was a courtesy to the horse and not a slight to her. She waited until the horse settled. It took about 4 minutes, the animal finally dropping its head with the particular resignation of something that has decided being difficult isn't worth the energy. And then she handed him the note. She watched him read it. His face didn't change. He handed it back. Where did you find it? In Henry's lunch pail. A long pause. He brought it to school, not to me. Yes. His jaw tightened slightly. It was the most reaction she'd seen from him on anything. And it wasn't anger about the note. It was about Henry, about his 10-year-old boy being used as a delivery mechanism for a threat. She understood why that particular thing would land harder than everything else. What's the Whitmore Range? She asked. He was quiet for a moment. The bay horse stood at the fence, watching them both with large, philosophical eyes. I worked a range called Whitmore in '79, he said, in Colorado. There was a situation there, a land dispute that turned into something worse. A man died. He looked at the note, not at her. I wasn't involved in the death, but I was there, and I made certain choices, and the way those choices could be described depends entirely on who's doing the describing. And Crow knows about it. Apparently. Is it something that could... She stopped, chose her words. Is it something he could use to damage you, legally? No, but it's something he could use to make people look at me differently. He finally looked at her. Small towns have long memories for certain kinds of stories. A man who was present when another man died, even if he had nothing to do with it, that story has a way of growing. She thought about her father's bankruptcy, about how a story could have a life entirely separate from its facts. We're a pair, she said. Something in his expression shifted, not softening exactly, but adjusting, like a door opening a few inches in a room that had been closed. He's escalating, she said. The arson, now this. He's not being careful anymore. That means something. It means the survey spooked him, Rhett said. The surveyor came yesterday, filed the documentation this morning. If Crow's lawyer found out, He found out, she said. That's why this is happening now. He nodded. He took the note from her and walked to the corner of the yard where there was a fire barrel, lit a match, and burned it the same way she'd burned the first one. Practical. No ceremony. There's a meeting of ranchers I've been talking to, he said, watching the paper burn. Saturday evening. Folks who've given me testimony. I want you there. She hadn't expected that. Why? Because they need to see that this isn't just a ranch foreman with a grudge. He looked at her. They need to see that the school is part of this, that it's connected to everything Crow has been doing. He paused. And because you're better at talking to frightened people than I am. She wasn't sure that was true. She thought she might just be better at appearing not to be frightened herself, which wasn't exactly the same skill, but sometimes served the same purpose. Saturday, she said. 6 o'clock. The alderman barn. He picked up the horse's bridle from the fence post. Bring your figures. She walked back to school in the afternoon heat, along the same honest road, and she thought about all of it. The burned shed and the surveys and the frightened families and Dora Wicks reorganizing a shelf. She didn't need to reorganize, and Henry Calloway with a note in his lunch pail and a father who had been present when a man died in Colorado in 1879 and had apparently been carrying that for 15 years. She thought about Red Hollow, which she had not chosen to love but had loved anyway, which was how love usually worked in her experience. She thought about how far they still had to go and how little time they had to get there. The school was still standing when she got back. She went inside, built a small fire in the stove, using wood she'd had to buy from the mercantile at twice the normal cost because her own supply was ash, and sat down at her desk with her notebook. The board vote was in 4 weeks. She started writing. The Saturday meeting in the alderman barn drew 11 people. Red had expected 8, maybe 9. The extra 2 were the Garrity brothers, who showed up without being invited, having heard about it from Forrest Delacroix, who had apparently decided somewhere between signing over his water rights and watching his daughter come home quiet from school that he was done being quiet himself. They came in late, stood near the back wall with their hats in their hands, and didn't say anything for the first 20 minutes, just listened. Vivian stood at the front near a work table where she'd spread her notes and figures. She'd been in enough classrooms to know how to hold a room, but a classroom of frightened adults was different from a classroom of children, and she didn't pretend otherwise to herself. These were people who had already lost things. You couldn't inspire people out of fear by being inspiring at them. You had to give them something concrete to hold on to, something that felt more solid than what they were afraid of. So she started with the survey. The surveyor filed the documentation in Cheyenne on Thursday morning, she said. What that means, practically, is that the legal basis Crow's lawyer has been building, the argument that the original land grant was improperly recorded, now has a direct counter. The physical markers on the ground establish the property line regardless of the clerical error in the county record. His lawyer can still argue it, but he's arguing uphill now. She let that sit. She watched the room process it. The Delacroix brothers exchanging a look, the Henderson couple in the third row with the careful stillness of people who had learned not to show hope too easily because hope was expensive when it didn't pay out. That's the school, said a man named Cord Garrity, one of the brothers who'd come in late. He had a voice like something dragged over gravel. What about the rest of it? The water rights, the mortgages, the assessor? That's what we're here to talk about, Vivian said. Rhett took it from there because this part was his. He knew these people and their specific situations in a way she didn't, and she understood enough about rooms to know when to step aside. He laid it out methodically, the pattern of it, the way Crow had moved from one family to the next, not in a rush, but with the patience of someone who understood that slow pressure was more durable than fast force. He named amounts. He named dates. He named the lawyer in Cheyenne, whose name turned out to be known to at least 4 people in the room, and not favorably. The room got quieter as he talked. Not the quiet of disengagement, the opposite, the quiet of people hearing their own experience named out loud by someone else, which had its own particular weight. He got my father's grazing lease in 81, said a young woman near the left wall, who Vivian recognized as one of the older Harmon children, grown now and running the family place since her father's health had failed. I always thought it was our fault, that we'd missed something or done something wrong. You didn't do anything wrong, Rhett said. He built the pressure specifically so it would feel like your fault. That's how it works. She nodded slowly, Her jaw was set hard in the way of someone who is being careful not to show how much that lands. Cord Garrity spoke again from the back. So what do we do about it? Concretely. Written testimony, Rhett said. Documented, signed, specific. Amounts, dates, names, what was said, who was present. We've got 3 already. I need at least 8 to take to the territorial authorities and have it mean something. A pause, longer than Vivian would have liked. What happens to us if we sign? Said Thomas Henderson. He was a careful man, lean and weathered, who chose his words with the precision of someone who had learned that imprecise words had consequences. Say we sign, and it goes to the authorities, and the authorities take 6 months to do anything. Crow still holds our note. He can call it due whenever he wants. I know, Rhett said. So signing puts us at risk right now for a benefit that might come later, maybe. Yes, Rhett said. That's accurate. Another silence. This one had a different texture, not resistant, but honest. These were people doing real arithmetic, and Vivian respected that, even when it was hard to sit with. He already has everything he's going to take from me, said Forrest Delacroix, quietly. He was a big man, made to look smaller by something that had happened to his posture in the past few months. He's got the ditch. He's got the East Field arrangement. Short of taking the house, there's not much left to threaten. He looked at his hands. I'll sign. His brother Clement, beside him, nodded once. That shifted something in the room. Not immediately. There was still hesitation, still the careful calculation of people with real things to lose. But the Delacroix agreement had moved the center of gravity. By the time the evening was over, 6 people had agreed to written statements. 2 more said they'd think about it and let Rhett know by midweek. The Harmon woman said she'd sign but wanted to read what she was signing first, which was reasonable, and Vivian told her so. 11 people who'd come in separately, suspicious and tired, left with something different. Not confidence exactly. Confidence would have been too easy, too fast, not earned. But something that felt like the beginning of the recognition that they weren't alone in a situation they'd each been experiencing as private humiliation. After they left, Rhett and Vivian stood in the barn with the lantern burning low, and she looked at her notes and thought about the 4 weeks ahead and felt the size of what they were trying to do pressing down on her. 6 statements isn't 8, she said. No, he said, and we still don't have Dora Wicks confirmed. No, she exhaled. The board vote is in 26 days. He leaned against a stall post with his arms crossed, looking at nothing particular. He had the quality she'd noticed before. The ability to be still without being absent, like he was processing something behind a face that didn't broadcast the work. There's something else, he said. She waited. I talked to Harlan Pruitt this week. He said it without particular inflection. I know. Pruitt's crows. But I wanted to know what he actually knows, so I bought him a coffee and let him talk. What did he say? He's been told the vote is a formality. The Crows people have already arranged for the county to accept the sale regardless of what the board decides, through the assessor's office. He paused. Which might or might not be true, but it tells me Crow's confident enough that he's not working hard at the vote itself. He thinks it's done. Which means he might not be watching it as carefully as he should be, Vivian said. That was my thought. She wrote something in her notebook. She had the habit, when working through a problem, of writing the pieces down not because she needed the notes to remember them, but because the act of writing clarified what she actually thought. She wrote, Pruitt, formality, assessor, confidence. Then she wrote something else, which she looked at for a moment before she said it out loud. What do you know about the parcel south of the Alderman, the unused range between your southern fence and the Garrison Creek Road? He looked at her. That's Alderman land. About 400 acres of mixed pasture and timber. The nephew hasn't done anything with it. What's it worth? He named a figure cautiously. If it were offered to the county, she said, for future public development, a park, a second school building when the population warrants it, a community grazing commons, would the nephew consider it? The silence that followed was the specific silence of a man realizing he hasn't thought far enough in a direction he thought he'd thought through. You want to offer Crow's Railroad an alternative, he said slowly. I want to offer the county something that makes the school land less necessary, she said. If there's a documented alternative parcel available for public use, donated, not sold, The argument that the school land is essential to future development weakens. Crow's lawyer has been arguing the railroad spur is a public good that justifies taking the school property. If the public has another option, the argument falls apart, he said. It doesn't fall apart, she said honestly, but it gets a lot more complicated. And complicated is enough if we have the testimony and the survey and a board member or two who are actually paying attention. He was quiet for a full minute. She'd learned in the past few weeks that his silences meant he was working, not stalling, and that interrupting them was not useful. I'd have to talk to the nephew, he said finally. He's not unreasonable. He trusts me on the ranch operations. But this is different. This is asking him to donate significant property in a fight he's not aware of. Yes, she said. He might say no. He might. Another pause. I'll ride to Laramie next week. He's been staying at his cousin's place there. He unfolded himself from the stall post. This is a considerable gamble. I know it is. If it doesn't work, then we've lost something we were probably going to lose anyway, she said, and we'll have lost it fighting, which is different from just losing it. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't entirely read. It wasn't admiration, or not only that, it was more complicated than that. It was the look of someone reassessing a calculation they thought they'd already completed. Get some sleep, he said. You've been at this since 6 this morning. She had been. She gathered her notes and her notebook and the lamp she'd brought from town and walked home through the dark Wyoming night, which was by now familiar enough that the dark felt comfortable rather than threatening. The particular stars of this latitude, the smell of the sage and the distant water. She was 200 yards from her rented room at the Fenn's place when she understood that someone was following her. It wasn't dramatic. No sound of footsteps, nothing cinematic about it. It was just the small, persistent feeling of observed space that she'd developed an instinct for in the months since the dance. The way a person's body learns to read what it can't see when it's been paying close enough attention. She didn't stop walking. She didn't change her pace. She adjusted her grip on the lamp slightly. It was heavier than a candle. And if it came to it, heavier was useful. Nothing happened. She reached the Fenn's gate, went inside, bolted the door behind her, and stood in the dark hallway breathing steadily. She didn't sleep particularly well. The following week moved like the inside of a clock, all the parts turning at different speeds for the same purpose. Rhett left for Laramie on Monday. 2 more written statements came in, which put them at 8, which was what he'd said they needed. The Harmon woman, whose name was Bess, brought hers in personally on Tuesday morning, having clearly read every word of it twice, and said, I want the territorial authorities to know exactly what that man did to my father's operation, which she said with a flatness that was more frightening than if she'd been emotional about it. On Wednesday, Crow came to the school. She'd half expected it, and still wasn't fully prepared for it, which was the nature of things you half expect. He arrived during the noon hour when the children were outside, alone, without his usual attendants, which was a different kind of signal than his usual performance. He knocked on the open door, which she noted. He knocked. He didn't just walk in, which meant he was choosing the version of himself that was civil, which meant he wanted something he thought required civility. Miss Mercer, he said, I hope I'm not interrupting. You are, she said. But you knew that. He came in anyway. He looked around the classroom with the frank appraisal of a man pricing property, which was exactly what he was doing, and she watched him do it without attempting to hide that she was watching. I want to make you an offer, he said. He sat down on the edge of the desk nearest the door, which was one of the older students' desks, and the casual ownership of the gesture, sitting in her classroom uninvited on her furniture, was completely deliberate. I'll hear it, she said. She didn't sit down. $200, he said, and a letter of recommendation to any school district in the territory. He met her eyes. You take that, and you relocate, and this whole situation becomes uncomplicated. $200 was more than 6 months of her salary. She was aware of that. She was aware that he was aware of that. And the school? She said. The school board will manage the school. That's not your concern. It's entirely my concern. Miss Mercer. He leaned forward slightly, hands clasped. I've done my research. I know about your father. I know about the Hartwell investors, the families who lost their savings. He said it carefully, not cruelly, which was somehow worse than cruelty. I know about the circumstances under which you left Philadelphia. A woman in your position, with your history, a clean start somewhere new, with money in her pocket and a solid reference, is considerably better than what she currently has. She stood very still. "I'm giving you an opportunity," he said, "because I don't take pleasure in making things hard for people who don't have to be in the middle of this." "You burned my woodshed," she said. A pause. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Yes, you do." She said it quietly, the way he'd said things to her at the dance, like a fact being presented, take it or leave it. "You burned it, and you put a note in a 10-year-old boy's lunch pail, and you've spent 3 months filing fraudulent paperwork in Cheyenne to steal a piece of land that a school has been standing on for 12 years. She looked at him. "I'm not going to take your $200. His expression didn't change. That was the thing about men like Crow. The face was a tool, not a window. "That's a shame," he said. "Is it?" "You're a smart woman," he said. "Smart enough to know you're not going to win this." "Maybe," she said. "But you came here to offer me money to leave, which means something I'm doing is worrying you, so I think we have different ideas about how this is going to end." He stood up. He straightened his coat with the deliberate care of a man who is making himself settle before he says something he'd rather not say. "The vote is in 3 weeks," he said. "Whatever you think you're building, I know when the vote is." He looked at her for a moment. That look again. The one from the dance, the cold recalculation. Then he walked out. She waited until she heard his horse leave the street before she sat down at her desk and put her hands flat on the surface and breathed until her heart rate came back to something she recognized. The children came back in from noon recess. She taught the afternoon session. Fractions for the middle group. She told Henry Calloway, who was starting to genuinely understand them, that he was making real progress, and meant it, and watched the same satisfaction cross his face that always did, and thought, this is what we're here for. Rhett came back from Laramie on Friday evening. She met him at the Alderman gate. She'd been checking, which she wasn't going to admit was checking, but was, and knew from the way he rode in that it had gone well, not because he looked pleased, but because he didn't look the way he'd looked when things had gone badly in the previous weeks. "He said yes," Rhett said, swinging down from the horse. She exhaled. "He understood what we were asking? I told him the whole situation. He's young, and he doesn't know ranching, but he's not stupid, and he's got no particular fondness for Crow, who apparently tried to buy the alderman out from under him 6 months ago. He tied the horse to the post. He'll sign a deed of donation for the south parcel to the county, contingent on the school land being protected." "Contingent," she said. "That's the right word. We don't want to give it away before we've won." "No." He looked at her. "Crow came to see you." She wasn't surprised he'd heard. "Wednesday." "What did he offer?" $200 and a reference. Something went through his face, quick and controlled. "That's insulting." "I thought so." "What did you say?" "I told him no, and I told him I knew he burned the shed." She paused. He denied it, naturally. Rhett was quiet. He was doing that processing behind the face thing. "He's getting nervous," he said finally. "Crow doesn't make personal visits. He sends lawyers and hired men. If he came himself—" "The survey spooked him," she said, "and I think someone told him about the meeting Saturday." "There were 11 people in that barn," he said. "I trust most of them. Most." "It doesn't matter who told him," she said. "What matters is what we do with the next 3 weeks." She had, in her notebook, a plan. She'd been building it since the evening she'd walked home in the dark with the feeling of being followed, which had clarified something for her. That waiting and preparing was not the same as being ready. Being ready meant moving, and moving meant making choices before Crow made them for her. She laid it out for Rhett at the fence line in the evening light. 8 signed statements, the survey, the alderman parcel donation contingent on outcome, and one more element she hadn't told him yet. "I want to present all of it at the board meeting," she said. "Not just the survey, not just the testimony. All of it, together publicly, in front of the town." He looked at her. "The board meeting is not a public forum." "It is if enough people show up," she said. "The open meetings law for territorial school boards. I've been corresponding with the lawyer in Cheyenne who confirmed it. Any citizen can attend and request to address the board. They can't be turned away." She paused. "If we bring the ranchers, if we bring the community, if Crow walks into a room expecting a formality and finds the whole town looking at him, it changes the calculation," he said. "It changes everything?" she said. because it stops being a legal argument and starts being a public record. Whatever he does after that, everyone in Red Hollow will have seen it. He was quiet for longer than usual. The evening was doing its particular Wyoming thing, the light going golden and long across the pasture, the mountains doing something complicated with the clouds that she still didn't have adequate language for. "There's something I want to ask you," he said. His tone had changed in the way that tones change when a conversation is about to become a different conversation. She waited. "The contingency on the alderman parcel donation," he said. "The nephew's conditions. One of them," he didn't say it directly, but it was clear, "is that whoever is making the donation on behalf of the ranch has a stable, established position in the community." He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the fence line. A foreman's position is not the same as an owner's standing in a land matter, especially with a territorial filing. She understood what he was approaching. She could see it from where she was standing, and she was watching him navigate toward it with the same focused care he'd used with the bay horse that hadn't decided yet whether to trust a bridle. "Rhett," she said. "I'm not saying this the right way," he said. "You're saying we'd have a stronger position," she said, "in every part of this, the filing, the board meeting, the donation. If we weren't a school teacher and a ranch foreman acting together, but a married couple with joint standing in the community." He finally looked at her. "Yes," he said. "That's what I'm saying." The word sat between them in the evening air. She looked at him for a long moment. He was not a man who said things he didn't mean, and he was not saying this with the ardor of a man in love. He was saying it with the honesty of a man who had looked at a situation from every angle and arrived at a conclusion that was real regardless of how it had arrived. Which was, she thought, more trustworthy than ardor, because ardor was imprecise and this required precision. "That's a considerable solution to a legal problem," she said. "It's also," he said carefully, "something I've been thinking about for reasons that are not entirely tactical." He said this with some difficulty, the way a practical man says a non-practical thing, not gracefully, but genuinely. "I want to be clear about that." She absorbed this. She thought about the morning at the schoolhouse fence when she hadn't known his name. She thought about his coffee, which was better than hers. She thought about him writing to Laramie for a 4-hour conversation with a confused young heir because it needed to be done. She thought about the way he'd burned the notes. Simply, practically, no drama. And the way he'd sat on the schoolhouse step while she did arithmetic. "When?" she said. "Before the vote," he said. "That gives us 2 weeks to file the paperwork and establish standing before the board meeting." She looked out at the pasture, at the evening light, at the mountains doing their complicated thing. She had come to Red Hollow to be somewhere that wasn't Philadelphia, to build something that was hers, to prove something to herself about the kind of person she was when nobody who knew her was watching. She had built it. It was being threatened, and the man standing at this fence line with her was the clearest, most honest person she had encountered in 8 months in this town, which was not a small thing, and she was not going to pretend it was. "All right," she said. He nodded. Once. The decision-making nod. "I should probably," he started. "Yes," she said. "You probably should." He almost smiled. It was the closest thing to a full smile she'd seen from him, and it was crooked and brief and looked like it surprised him slightly. "Saturday," he said. If that works." "Saturday," she said. She walked home in the dark again. The same stars, the same sage smell, the same road. But the arithmetic was different now. The variables had shifted, and when she got to the fens gate and bolted the door behind her and stood in the hallway, she wasn't thinking about who might have been following her. She was thinking about everything that had to happen before the board meeting, and how they now had a fighting chance at actually pulling it off, and how that was a strange and unfamiliar feeling that she decided after a moment to simply allow. They were married on a Saturday morning in the Red Hollow Justice of the Peace's office, which smelled like old paper and wood polish and had a water stain on the ceiling that Vivian found herself studying during the brief ceremony because looking at it was easier than figuring out what expression to wear. The Justice of the Peace was a man named Aldous Webb, who had married approximately 40 couples in his tenure and had developed the efficient warmth of someone who understood that people came to him in a variety of emotional states, and the kindest thing he could do was be quick and clear. He read the words. They said the words back. Rhett's hand was dry and steady when he took hers for the required moment, and his grip was neither too firm nor uncertain, just present, which she thought was exactly him. Martha Fenn was there as witness, because Vivian had needed a witness, and Martha was the person in Red Hollow she trusted most with information, which was not the same as trusting her with gossip, but was the best available option. Martha cried, which nobody had expected, and apologized for crying, and then cried a little more. Cord Garrity was the second witness, Rhett's choice, a man of few words who signed the document with the focused precision of someone who understood that his signature meant something and was treating it accordingly. Afterward, standing on the street outside Webb's office in the thin June morning light, Vivian thought, well, that's done then. It was not a romantic thought. It was the thought of a woman who had just made a significant and somewhat terrifying decision and was managing the terror by treating it as an item checked off a list. She was aware this was not the conventional response to getting married. She was also aware that nothing about the last 2 months had been conventional, so consistency was at least something. The filing, she said. I'll take it to the county clerk this afternoon, Rhett said. He had the deed of donation paperwork under his arm. The alderman nephew had signed it 3 days ago in Laramie, contingent on the school land outcome, and Rhett had ridden back with it rolled carefully in his saddlebag. The marriage certificate goes with it. It establishes joint standing. The board meeting is 12 days out, she said. I know. Martha had stopped crying and was looking at both of them with an expression Vivian couldn't fully categorize. Fondness, maybe, and something like affectionate exasperation. Are you two going to do anything that isn't tactics? She said. Later, Vivian said. She didn't entirely mean it as a deflection. Rhett looked at her. Something in his expression was quiet in a way that was different from his usual quietness. Careful, maybe, or patient with a longer horizon than the immediate. Come out to the alderman tonight, he said. Bring your things. She had at the Fens 1 trunk, 1 small bag, and a box of books. It took her 40 minutes to pack everything she owned in Red Hollow, which she thought said something about the life she'd been living here. Clean and unencumbered, and in certain ways lonely in a way she hadn't let herself name. She said goodbye to Martha, who cried again briefly, and to the rented room that had served her well, and rode out to the alderman in the early afternoon with her trunk and a borrowed cart. The ranch house was not what she'd imagined, though she hadn't let herself imagine it much. It was a working house, solid, practical, in need of paint in 2 or 3 places, with a kitchen that was large and functional, and a main room that had a good fireplace and a wall of bookshelves that surprised her, pleasantly. The shelves held a mixture of ranch management texts, territorial surveys, and what appeared to be a substantial collection of history books that were worn with actual reading. Yours? She asked, nodding at the books. Most of them, he said. He was carrying her trunk, which she hadn't asked him to do and was going to let him do anyway because the stairs were narrow. Some were aldermen's. He had an education he didn't talk about much. She looked at the titles. A lot of American history, some natural science, 3 volumes of territorial land law that were flagged heavily with paper markers. You've been preparing for this fight for a while, she said. Since '81, he said, from the stairs. Since the first time I watched Crow take something that wasn't his and understood that nobody was going to stop him unless someone did the work. She heard him set the trunk down upstairs. She stood in the main room and looked at the bookshelves and the fireplace and the window that faced south across the pasture and thought, this is a serious person's house. It had been built by someone who intended to stay, not someone passing through. She thought about her father's house in Philadelphia, which had been a beautiful house full of beautiful objects that had turned out to be, in the end, the wrong kind of serious. Serious about appearance rather than substance, and when the substance went, the appearance meant nothing. This was different. She decided to let herself notice that. The next 11 days were the most concentrated work of her life. She taught school every day, all day, because the children still had 3 weeks left in the term, and they still needed fractions and geography and the history of a republic that was still in the process of deciding what it was. She kept that completely separate, as much as she could. The classroom was the classroom, and whatever was happening in the larger struggle, it didn't come inside those walls while the students were there. After school was a different matter. Rhett had set up a workroom of sorts in the ranch house, a table cleared of everything except the 8 sworn statements, the survey documentation, the deed of donation paperwork, and the correspondence from the Cheyenne lawyer, a woman named Estelle Brandt, who had been invaluable and businesslike and charged a reasonable fee. Every evening, Vivian and Rhett sat at that table and worked through what they had and what they still needed and how to present it. The presenting was what she kept coming back to. The evidence mattered. The survey mattered. The testimony mattered. But none of it would matter in the right way if it was delivered badly. If it felt like an ambush, or like an accusation before witnesses, or like two people nursing a grudge. It needed to feel like what it was. A community laying out facts and asking for a decision based on those facts. The order matters, she said, on the fifth evening, moving papers around the table. We can't start with the testimony because that puts him immediately on the defensive and he'll have his lawyer object to procedure before we get through the first statement. Start with the survey, Rhett said. He was across the table from her, reading through the Brandt correspondence. It's the cleanest. Pure documentation, no interpretation required, establishes the legal foundation before anything else gets laid on it. Then the donation offer, she said, because that reframes the whole narrative where we're not just defending, we're offering the county something. We're showing that there's a path forward that doesn't require taking the school. Then the testimony. Then the testimony. She looked at the 8 statements. In what order? He thought about it. Forrest Delacroix first. He's the most compelling because the water rights situation is straightforward and recent, and he can speak to it without getting emotional. A pause. Bess Harmon last. She's the most controlled. And what happened to her father's operation is the longest-running example. It gives the board the full scope. She nodded, writing. We need someone to organize the community attendance, not just ranchers, townspeople, the families who have children in the school, the business owners who depend on a functioning community. Dora Wicks, he said. Vivian looked up. You think she'll do it? I think she's been waiting for someone to ask her to do something specific. He set down the correspondence. She doesn't respond to general appeals. She responds to tasks. Vivian thought about the dry goods store, the shelf that didn't need organizing. I'll talk to her tomorrow. She did, before school, standing in the store in the early quiet. Dora listened to the full ask, Ray. Show up at the board meeting, bring whoever she could, make it clear to the board that this was a community matter and not just a dispute between interested parties, without interrupting. That's going to make Harlan Pruitt very uncomfortable, Dora said. Good, Vivian said. Dora looked at her. You're different than you were in the spring. Vivian wasn't sure what to say to that, so she said nothing. I'll do it, Dora said. She turned back to her counter. Tell people it's at 2 o'clock and to be on time. I can't stand when people are late to things. The 2 days before the meeting were when Crow made his last moves. She should have anticipated it. She had anticipated it, in the abstract, had told herself he wouldn't simply wait. But the specific form it took still landed with enough force to knock her sideways for an afternoon. He went to the school board, not the full board, specifically to James Okafor, the member she'd been most confident of, the man who had asked twice about his daughter's reading progress with genuine attention. Crow met with him privately, and she didn't know the substance of that meeting until Okafor came to the school himself, the evening before the vote, with the look of a man who had been offered something and was ashamed of himself for considering it. He knocked on the schoolhouse door, where she was staying late preparing her materials for the following day. Mr. Okafor, she said. He came in and stood just inside the door and didn't sit down, which told her something. He was a careful man, a good man in the basic sense, but he was a man with a family and a business and obligations that pulled in several directions. He offered to cancel my supply contract, Okafor said. She knew he had a contract with the Crow operation for feed supply to his small livestock operation. It wasn't his primary income, but it wasn't nothing. And to give you what instead, she said, a seat on the new development board he's forming, for the railroad project. He looked at the floor. It's a legitimate position, real compensation. She was quiet for a moment. She thought about the carefully constructed weight of what Crow did. Never pure threat, always mixed with something that looked like opportunity, so that when a person made the choice, they could tell themselves it wasn't cowardice, it was pragmatism. Is your daughter still in this school? She said. Okafor looked up. Yes. Do you want her to still be in this school? Miss Mercer. He stopped. Mrs. Calloway. He caught himself. I know what I should do. I came here because I thought. I don't know what I thought. I think you came here because you wanted someone to tell you that doing the right thing was going to be all right, she said. And I can't promise you that. I can tell you that we have a strong case and that we're going to make it tomorrow, and that whatever happens after that, your daughter will know what her father did when it mattered. He was quiet for a long moment. Something moved across his face that she recognized. The particular resignation of a person who has made a decision they knew they were going to make all along, but needed to sit with the cost of it first. I'll be there tomorrow, he said. My vote hasn't changed. He left. She stood in the empty classroom and breathed carefully and then went back to organizing her papers, because there was still work to do. She told Rhett about it that night. He listened without surprise. He's running out of angles, Rhett said. Going to Okafor directly, that close to the vote. He's trying to shore up something that's gotten shaky. He looked at her. That's good for us. Or he has something else we don't know about, she said. That's also possible. She appreciated that he didn't dismiss it. What time do you want to be there? 1 o'clock, he said. I want the ranchers there before Crow's people arrive. I want them to see a full room when they walk in. She nodded. She was looking at the final arrangement of documents she'd prepared. 3 copies of everything, organized in order of presentation, pages numbered, nothing left to chance in the mechanics of it. The arguments themselves couldn't be controlled. The mechanics could. Are you afraid? Rhett asked. It was a direct question. He didn't ask many direct personal questions. Yes, she said. Not of Crow. She thought about how to say it. I'm afraid that we've done everything right and it won't be enough. That sometimes things that should be stoppable aren't stopped. She looked at the papers. That's the fear. He was quiet. He didn't offer reassurance, which she would have found condescending, or tell her that was unlikely, which would have been dishonest. He said, I know, which was the most useful thing anyone could have said. The morning of the board meeting, Vivian taught school. She'd debated this, had considered taking the day to prepare, to go through the materials one more time, to manage her nerves in whatever way was available. But her students didn't know what was happening today, and they didn't need to, and they had a geography test she'd promised them, and she had never canceled a promise to her students, and she wasn't going to start now. She gave the geography test. She graded it while they did their reading. 11 out of 12 passed, and the one who didn't, a boy named Silas, who had been struggling all term, got closer than he ever had, which she marked at the top of his paper with good work. Keep going. She dismissed them at noon. Henry Calloway lingered at the door. My dad says there's a meeting today, he said. There is. About the school? She looked at him. He was 10 years old, with Rhett's serious eyes and a way of standing that was already a little like his father's, that contained thoughtful posture. Yes, she said, about the school. He thought about this. Is it going to be okay? She could have deflected. She could have told him not to worry, that adults were handling it, that he should go home and do his afternoon chores. I think so, she said. We've done everything we can to make it okay. She met his eyes. That's all anyone can do. He nodded with the seriousness of someone receiving information and left. She walked to the Grange Hall at 1:15. The meeting was at 2. Rhett was already there. The room had been set with chairs in rows facing a long table at the front where the board would sit. There were perhaps 40 chairs, which had been optimistic when Pruitt arranged it, and which was now clearly insufficient. The Delacroix brothers were there. Bess Harmon was there. The Hendersons, the Garrity's, the Harmon woman's 2 cousins. 3 families she recognized from Sunday service. Galt from the Mercantile, who surprised her. And near the back wall, standing rather than sitting because there weren't enough chairs, Dora Wicks, with 6 other townswomen who had apparently responded to her specific and efficiently worded invitation. There were people standing along the walls. Vivian estimated 60, maybe 65 people in a room that had chairs for 40. Rhett was at the front, talking quietly with Estelle Brandt, the Cheyenne lawyer, who had come up for the day at her own suggestion. He saw Vivian come in and gave the small nod. Crow arrived at 1:50. He came through the door and stopped, and she watched him read the room, the same way she'd watched him read it at the dance, that quick, comprehensive assessment. She saw the moment he understood that this was not the room he had arranged for. He had two men with him and his lawyer, a lean man named Pratchett, who she'd heard of but not met, and they took seats to the right side of the room. Pratchett leaned in and said something to Crow. Crow didn't respond, just looked straight ahead. The 5 board members came in at 2 o'clock. Pruitt, Okafor, Dora Wicks, who had apparently been asked to attend as a board member and a community organizer simultaneously, and the 2 others, a man named Bell and a woman named Cora Seeger, who Vivian had spoken to once and assessed as genuinely undecided rather than Crow's. Pruitt looked at the room and sat down with the expression of a man who had expected to spend an easy afternoon and now understood he would not be. "This meeting is called to order," he said. His voice was steady. Vivian gave him credit for that. Pratchett stood up immediately. "On behalf of the Crow development interests, I'd like to move that this meeting proceed according to the standard closed session procedure." "This meeting is open," Dora Wicks said. She said it from her position at the board table, flatly and without preamble. "It's an open meeting under territorial education law. I'd like the record to reflect that." Pratchett looked at Pruitt. Pruitt looked at his hands. "The meeting is open," he said, with the exhaustion of a man who has just understood how the next 2 hours are going to go. Vivian stood up. She didn't ask for permission because asking for permission would have framed her as a supplicant rather than a stakeholder, which was a distinction she'd thought about carefully. She stood up and said, "I'd like to present materials relevant to the board's decision, if the board is willing to hear them." Bell said, "The board will hear them." He said it without looking at Pruitt, which told Vivian something useful. She presented the survey first, as planned. She kept it clean and factual, walked through the documentation carefully, explained what the surveyor had found and what it meant for the legal argument Pratchett had been filing. She handed copies to each board member, to Pratchett and to Crow directly, which she did by walking across the room and setting the papers on the arm of his chair because she wanted him to have to hold the evidence while he listened to the rest of it. He took the papers without expression. The donation offer came next. Estelle Brandt presented this because it was a legal instrument and required the standing of a legal professional. She explained the alderman parcel, its size and location and value, the conditions attached, and the effect it had on the county's development calculus. The room was very quiet while she spoke. Then Rhett stood up. He was not a public speaker by nature, and he knew it, and he didn't pretend otherwise. He didn't have Vivian's classroom authority or Brandt's professional precision. What he had was 12 years of watching this valley, and a flat directness that carried its own weight. "I've collected 8 sworn statements from ranchers and landholders in this territory," he said. "I'm going to read sections of each of them into the record. The full documents are available to the board, to the territorial authorities, and to anyone in this room who wants to see them." He read. He read for 20 minutes, and the room stayed quiet, in the way rooms stay quiet when people are hearing things spoken aloud that they have known but never heard named. The water rights coercion, the manipulated mortgage, the assessor's fraudulent reclassification, the pattern of it, methodical, patient, designed to look like legitimate business until it was assembled in one place and the pattern became visible. Forrest Delacroix, 3 rows back, sat with his arms on his knees and his head down while his own statement was read. His brother put a hand on his back. When Rhett finished, Pratchett started to stand. Crow put a hand on his arm. Pratchett sat back down. The room noticed. 40 people watched Crow stop his own lawyer from responding, and the silence that followed that gesture said more than any argument Pratchett could have made. Cora Seeger, who Vivian had assessed as undecided, said quietly, "Mr. Crow, would you like to respond to any of what we've heard?" Crow looked at her. He looked at the room, at the Delacroix brothers, at Bess Harmon with her controlled jaw, at Dora Wicks at the board table, at Galt from the Mercantile, who had no particular dog in this fight, except that he lived here and apparently had a conscience about it. "My attorney will respond in writing," Crow said, "through the appropriate channels." "That's your right," Seeger said. Her voice was even. "But the board is voting today." Something moved across Crow's face that Vivian had not seen there before. Not defeat. Not yet. Something earlier than defeat, the recognition that the ground he'd been standing on was not as solid as he'd built it to be, and that the people he'd assumed would stay quiet had instead shown up in a room 65 strong and looked at him. Pruitt called for the vote. Vivian stood completely still. She was aware of Rhett beside her, of the packed room behind her, of the board members arrayed at the long table. She looked at her hands, which were holding nothing, All the papers distributed, all the arguments made, nothing left to do. The vote was 4-1. Pruitt voted for the sale. She'd expected that, and it landed without surprise, and she noted that he seemed to be having trouble meeting anyone's eyes. Bell, Okafor, Seeger, and Dora Wicks voted against. The school land was not to be sold. The room didn't erupt the way rooms erupt in stories. It exhaled. A long collective breath, and then the lower sound of people talking to each other, the Delacroix brothers shaking Rhett's hand, Bess Harmon saying something quietly to Brant, Martha Fenn, who had apparently been somewhere in the back, producing a sound that was either laughing or crying and might have been both. Vivian looked at Crow. He was already standing, already turned toward the door, Pratchett at his shoulder. He didn't look back. She watched him go, and she thought about the $200 he'd offered her and the unsigned notes and the burned woodshed and the 12 years the school had stood on that land and the children who had learned to read inside it. Then Rhett was beside her. He wasn't touching her, just present, the way he'd learned to be present, which was as a fact rather than a performance. 4-1, she said. 4-1, he said. She looked at the room. Her community, she realized, not the word she would have used 8 months ago, but the word that fit now. The right one for the people around her, doing the ordinary, remarkable work of building something together in a hard place. The assessor situation, she said. The mortgages, the water rights, the 8 statements go to the territorial authorities. First thing tomorrow, he said. She nodded. She looked at the door Crow had gone through, already swinging still on its hinges. It wasn't over. She knew it wasn't over. The wind today was real, but the architecture of what he'd built in this valley, the mortgages, the water arrangements, the corruption in the assessor's office, all of that was still standing and would need to be dismantled piece by piece with the same stubborn patience he'd used to construct it. But the room had seen. That was the thing that couldn't be taken back now. 65 people had sat in this hall and watched the evidence laid out and made their choice. And choices made publicly had a different weight than private decisions because the witnesses remained. She picked up her bag. I need to check the schoolhouse, she said. Make sure everything's ready for tomorrow. He walked with her. Outside, the June afternoon was bright and warm, the mountains clear, the kind of day Wyoming occasionally produced as if to justify everything the other kind of days cost you. They walked down the main street and she was aware of people nodding as they passed. A different kind of nod than the ones she'd been getting for 8 months. Not polite but warm, not acknowledging her presence but acknowledging her. The schoolhouse was exactly as she'd left it. Desks in their rows, the bookshelves along the wall, the patched corner of the ceiling that still needed better work, the stove that ran hot, the window that faced the mountains. She stood in the doorway and looked at it in the afternoon light. It wasn't beautiful. It was functional and imperfect and the product of years of inadequate funding and volunteer labor and compromises made by people who were doing their best with what they had. She loved it without reservation. Tomorrow, she said. Tomorrow, Rhett said. She pulled the door shut and they walked back up the street together toward the work that was still ahead. Through the town they had, in their imperfect and unlikely way, helped keep. Crow left Red Hollow 11 days after the board meeting. He didn't announce it. There was no public statement, no letter to the newspaper, no farewell of any kind. One morning his house at the north edge of town simply had its curtains drawn, and by afternoon word had moved through the community the way word moved in small places, quietly, quickly, with a mixture of relief and the particular unease that comes when something you've been bracing against finally stops. Rhett heard it from the livery owner, who had watched Crow's men loading wagons before dawn. Vivian heard it from Martha Fenn, who had heard it from Galt, who had seen the wagons himself and counted them, 4, loaded with the portable elements of a man who owned too much in one place and was separating himself from it. He's not gone, Rhett said that evening. He was at the kitchen table with the territorial authority correspondence spread in front of him, the same table they'd been working at for weeks. He still owns the Henderson note. He still has the water arrangement with Delacroix on paper. He still has whatever he has on the assessor. I know, Vivian said. Leaving town isn't the same as letting go. No, she said, but it's a start. She was right that it was a start, and he was right that it wasn't an ending, and both of those things remained true through what came next. which was 3 months of the least glamorous work either of them had done in the whole of the fight. The correspondence, the filings, the careful documentation sent to the territorial authorities in Cheyenne, the follow-up when responses were slow, the meetings with Estelle Brandt conducted by letter when they couldn't make the trip, the patient and unglamorous assembly of a case that had to be built on paper because that was where Crow had built his operations, and that was where they had to be dismantled. The territorial investigation was announced in September. It was not dramatic. It was a paragraph in the Territorial Gazette that Vivian read at the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning before school, a dry official notice that an inquiry had been opened into certain land and water rights arrangements in the Red Hollow district. She read it twice, set it down, and went to teach school. She told Rhett that evening. He read the paragraph. He set the paper down. He was quiet for a moment. "Brandt did good work," he said. "We all did," she said. He looked at her. "Yes," he said. "We did." It wasn't a celebration. That would have been premature, and they had both learned enough about the distance between a battle won and a war concluded to avoid premature celebrations. But it was something, the kind of something that doesn't announce itself with noise but settles into the ground quietly and changes what grows there. The assessor, a man named Purdy, who had been making fraudulent reclassifications in exchange for a monthly arrangement with Crow's operation since at least 1880, resigned his position in October. He didn't admit to anything in his resignation letter, which was written with the careful vagueness of a man whose lawyer had told him not to admit to anything, but the resignation itself was its own admission to anyone paying attention, and Red Hollow was paying attention. The Garrity brothers got their east grazing lease reclassified back to agricultural use by November, which meant their costs dropped back to what they'd been before Purdy had gotten involved. It wasn't everything they'd lost. The 2 years of inflated fees were gone, and Crow's lawyers had been careful enough in the original arrangement that recovering those amounts was going to take longer than any of them wanted, but the ongoing harm stopped, which mattered. The Henderson mortgage was more complicated. Thomas Henderson came to the alderman on a cold November evening with the kind of quiet desperation that had been his habitual expression since Crow had acquired his note from the Laramie Bank, and sat across from Rhett and Vivian at the kitchen table and said, "The investigation isn't moving fast enough. He's going to call the note due in January." Rhett looked at the numbers Henderson had brought. The amount was manageable, so not easily, but manageable, so if refinanced through an actual bank rather than Crow's holding company. The problem was that Henderson's credit history, having been tangled up with Crow's machinations for 2 years, looked worse on paper than it was in reality. "Brandt knows a lender in Cheyenne who works with agricultural operations," Vivian said. "She mentioned it in September. I'll write to her tomorrow." Henderson looked at her. "Why would you do that?" She considered the question. It was genuine. He was genuinely asking, without the false modesty that sometimes made people disclaim help. He wanted to understand. "Because your situation exists because you got in the way of someone trying to take something from this community," she said. "That makes it a community problem, not just yours." He looked at his hands. He was a quiet man who held things in a way that wasn't healthy, and she could see the relief moving through him being complicated by the discomfort of accepting it. "I've never been good at letting people help," he said. "I know," she said. "Neither have I." Rhett looked at her, and the briefest thing passed across his face. Not a smile exactly, but its neighborhood, the acknowledgement of a truth that applied in more directions than one. The Cheyenne lender, through Brandt's introduction, refinanced the Henderson note in December at a rate that was actually lower than what the original Laramie Bank had offered, because the lender had been following the territorial investigation and understood that what had happened to the Henderson operation was not the result of poor management. Thomas Henderson shook Rhett's hand when it was done with a grip that said more than his words, which were few, and drove home in the December cold with the particular straightness of a man who has put down a weight he's been carrying so long he'd forgotten what his own posture felt like without it. Crow's formal operations in the territory were wound down over the winter. His holding company, 4 layers of paperwork that had taken Brandt and the territorial investigators the better part of 4 months to fully map, was dissolved in stages, each dissolution releasing something back to its original state. The water arrangement with the Delacroix brothers was voided when the investigators established it had been signed under duress. The Delacroix ditch returned to county management in February, and Forrest Delacroix came to the school the following week and stood outside until Vivian came to the door. "I wanted to say something," he said. He had recovered some of the uprightness he'd lost, though the hunching of the past year hadn't entirely left his shoulders. These things took longer to undo than they took to do. "You don't need to," she said. "I know I don't need to." He looked past her at the classroom. "Claire is reading better." "She's been reading better since September," Vivian said. "She reads very well, actually." Something in his face loosened. Not dramatically. This was a man who did not operate dramatically, but visibly. "Good," he said. "That's good." He left. She watched him walk back down the lane and thought about all the things that don't get resolved cleanly, that don't snap back into place when the pressure is removed, that require time and patience and the willingness to sit with incompleteness. His signature on that water arrangement was still real. The 2 years of anxiety and constraint that had shaped his posture were still real. The investigation had stopped the ongoing harm, but it could not undo the harm already done. And the distinction between those two things was one she was going to be sitting with for a long time. She went back inside and taught the afternoon session. Winter moved through the valley with its usual disregard for human schedules, and Red Hollow moved with it. Not the same as it had been before Crow, not exactly, but something that was working toward what it might become. The school had 8 more students by January, 3 of them from families who had been reluctant to invest in a school they weren't sure would still be standing by summer. The woodshed, rebuilt in October with lumber contributed by 6 different families and labor contributed by several more, was fully stocked and considerably better constructed than the original had been. Dora Wicks stopped Vivian on the street in February and said, without preamble, "I'm putting forward a proposal to the board to establish a permanent school maintenance fund, contributions from local businesses. It won't be much, but it'll be consistent." "That's a good idea," Vivian said. "I know it is," Dora said. "I'm also proposing you get a salary increase. Your current compensation is embarrassing, and I've been embarrassed by it for 8 months." She said this as a statement of fact, no ceremony around it. "The vote is next meeting." "Thank you, Dora." "Don't thank me. Vote for reasonable things with your own money when you have some." She walked on. Vivian stood on the street in the February cold and let herself feel something she'd been managing carefully for months, the thing that lived underneath the work and the fight and the steady forward motion. Not happiness exactly. Happiness was too simple a word for it, too lightweight. More like the feeling of standing on ground that was holding your weight and knowing, genuinely knowing and not just hoping that it would continue to hold. She walked home. Home was the alderman now, with the bookshelf full of worn histories and the kitchen that smelled like coffee and wood smoke and the window that faced south across the pasture. It was a long way from Philadelphia in ways that had nothing to do with geography. She had stopped thinking about Philadelphia as the place she had left and started thinking about it as the place that had produced her, shaped her, imperfectly and painfully, into someone who knew what she knew and could do what she had done. Her father's failure, which had been a wound for so long, had become a fact. Not a comfortable fact, but a settled one. She had written to him in December, a short letter, not warm exactly, but honest, which was more than they had managed in years. He had not yet replied, and she was not sure he would, and she had written it anyway because there was a difference between waiting for someone to deserve your effort and deciding your effort was worth making regardless. And she had arrived at that distinction somewhere in the previous year without being able to name the exact moment. It was March when she told Rhett about the child. She told him in the kitchen, in the morning, before the day had gotten started, because she had found that the kitchen in the early morning was where they talked about real things. Not the only place, but the reliable one. The place where the practical business of a working day hadn't yet organized itself around them. He was at the stove. She was sitting at the table with her coffee. She said it plainly, without build-up, the way he'd taught her, by example, not instruction, that real things were best said. He turned around. He was quiet for a moment, but it was the full kind of quiet, not the processing kind. She could see him working through something, and she waited, and he came and sat down across from her at the table. The same table where the 8 sworn statements had been organized, where the survey had been reviewed, where they'd planned every step of a fight that had changed the shape of both their lives. "When?" he said. "October, I think." He nodded. He was looking at her with the particular attention he gave to things that mattered, the same attention he gave to a young horse that hadn't decided whether to trust a bridle, to a fence line that needed to be set correctly, to a room full of frightened people who needed to hear the truth spoken plainly. "Are you all right?" he said. "Not are you happy?" That would have been a different question, an easier one, and he didn't ask easy questions. "Are you all right?" was the right question, the honest one, because all right was complicated and real and didn't assume anything about how she was supposed to feel. "Yes," she said. "I think I am." He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. Briefly, not dramatically, the way he'd held her hand at the justice of the peace, present and steady, without performance. Then he got up and poured more coffee into her cup and went back to the stove and said, "I'm going to fix the south fence today." The post shifted in the thaw. "All right," she said. "You'll be at school until 3. I'll be back before 3. She sat with her coffee and the morning light coming through the south window and thought, this is what it looks like. Not what she had imagined marriage might look like back in Philadelphia when she had imagined it at all. Not elegant or simple or free of complication, but real in the way the mountains were real, present regardless of what you thought about them, solid under conditions that would have dissolved something less genuine. She was not a woman given to sentiment, and she was not going to become one, but she allowed herself a moment with the coffee and the light. Just a moment before she gathered her things for school. Spring came. The way spring came in Wyoming. Reluctantly, then all at once, the snow retreating up the mountain faces and the pasture going from brown to green in a matter of weeks. The particular green of high country that was almost aggressive in its intensity after the long gray of winter. The school term had 3 weeks left when the final notice came from the territorial authorities. Estelle Brandt sent it by courier, which meant it was significant. Vivian opened it at the kitchen table on a Tuesday evening with Rhett beside her. The investigation into Baron Crow's holdings and business practices in the Red Hollow district had concluded. Findings of fraud in the water rights arrangements, conspiracy with a public official in the matter of the assessor's classifications, and predatory lending practices in the acquisition of the Henderson note. Crow's remaining territorial holdings, 2 parcels he'd acquired through the mechanisms the investigation had documented, were to be disposed of under territorial supervision, with proceeds directed to a remediation fund for affected parties. A separate proceeding, civil in nature, was ongoing and would allow the affected families to file for damages. Vivian read it twice, then set it on the table. "It's enough," Rhett said. "Is it?" she said. Not challenging, genuinely asking, because some of what Crow had taken couldn't be returned. The 2 years of anxiety, the signed papers in moments of desperation, the children who had come to school quieter than they should have been because their parents were carrying things no family should have to carry. "It's not everything," he said. "It never was going to be everything." He looked at the letter. "But it's enough to close it." She thought about this difference between justice and completion, which were not the same thing and which required separate kinds of peace. The law could address what was documented and quantifiable. What it could not address was what lived in people. The damage done to Forrest Delacroix's posture, the 2 years of fear in the Henderson household, the community's long practice of silence that Crow had cultivated carefully and that would take years more to fully unlearn. But you started where you could start. You addressed what could be addressed. And then you kept working, because the work didn't stop just because the most visible part of it was done. She wrote back to Brandt that evening, thanking her, and in the morning she went to school and taught the last 3 weeks of the term with the same consistency she'd maintained through everything. Fractions, geography, the history of a republic still deciding what it was. Her students were not the same students she'd started with in September. Most of them were older now, and all of them had grown in ways that had nothing to do with the curriculum. Henry Calloway, on the last day of term, presented her with a card that he had clearly labored over. The handwriting careful, the letters even. A small drawing in the corner that was either a schoolhouse or a barn. She couldn't entirely tell, but the intention was clear. "Dear Mrs. Calloway, thank you for teaching us that hard things can be figured out if you work at them long enough. Henry." She kept the card. She kept it in the same notebook where she'd done the arithmetic during the fire, where she'd written Pruitt, formality, assessor, confidence, where she'd made the lists and the plans and the careful figures that had been the architecture of everything they'd built and fought and won. The last day of term was a Friday. She closed the schoolhouse in the afternoon and stood outside for a moment in the June sun, looking at the building, the patched corner, the new woodshed properly built, the step that still needed a nail in the left board, the window that faced the mountains. 12 months. She had been in Red Hollow a full year. She had arrived alone, with a trunk and a box of books, and the need to be somewhere that wasn't what she'd left. She had built something here. Not what she'd planned, because what she'd planned had been modest and careful and had assumed she would remain at the edges of this community's life rather than in the middle of it. She had not planned to fall in love with a ranch foreman who counted under his breath when he danced and burned notes over fire barrels and rode to Laramie to talk a confused young heir into donating land he didn't know he had. She had not planned to fight for a schoolhouse in front of 65 people. She had not planned most of what had happened. This was, she had come to understand, generally how the best things worked. You planned carefully, and then the actual shape of your life arrived, and it was larger and stranger and more demanding than the plan, and you could retreat to the plan, hold to its original small dimensions, or you could let the larger thing be what it was and build something real out of it. She had chosen to build. And here was what she had learned from it, not as a lesson you could write neatly at the end of a chapter, but as a thing you knew in the body, the kind of knowing that comes from having lived it. Courage was not the absence of fear. She had been afraid almost continuously for the past year, afraid of failing the children, afraid of what Crow would do, afraid of making the wrong choices at the wrong moments, afraid of the vulnerability that came with caring about something you could lose. Courage was doing the work anyway. Courage was sitting down at a table with your fear and your arithmetic and making the next decision and then the next one, and not waiting until the fear went away because it didn't go away, it just got managed. And community was not a natural condition. It required construction. The 65 people in the Grange Hall on the day of the board vote had not arrived there by accident or sentiment. They had arrived because of a series of specific conversations, specific invitations, specific moments where one person had asked another person to show up and that person had decided to. Community was the accumulated weight of all those decisions made by imperfect people who were frightened and self-interested and busy, who showed up anyway because someone had made it clear that showing up mattered. She walked down the lane from the schoolhouse toward the main street, and the town was doing its afternoon business around her, a wagon going somewhere, the sound from the mercantile, a child she recognized from her class running an errand with the barely contained energy of someone who has just been released from 3 hours of sitting still. She thought about her father, who had not written back. She thought about it without the old sharp edge, just with the quiet acknowledgement that some things resolved in their own time and some things didn't resolve at all, and you learned to carry both without letting either one define you. She hoped he was all right. She hoped someday he would ask her about her life here, and she would be able to tell him, and maybe that conversation would be the beginning of something, and maybe it wouldn't. Both possibilities were ones she could live with now. Rhett was at the gate when she got back to the alderman, which wasn't unusual. He often finished the day's work around the time she returned from school, but he was standing at the gate rather than at the barn, which meant he'd been watching for her. "The south fence is done," he said. "Good." He fell into step beside her. They walked up to the house in the late afternoon light, past the pasture where 2 of the alderman's better horses were grazing with the unhurried authority of animals who knew their place in the world. Past the garden she'd started in April that was doing better than she'd expected and worse than she'd hoped, which felt about right. "Brant sent another note," he said. "The civil proceedings are scheduled for August. She thinks 3 of the families will recover meaningful amounts." 3 out of 6. 3 out of 6, he said. "Better than none." "Yes," she said. "Better than none." They went inside. The kitchen was warm from the afternoon sun, and the books were on the shelf, and the table was clear of paperwork for the first time in months, just a clean table in a working house at the end of a working day. She sat down. He poured coffee, because that was what he did, and she didn't tell him the coffee was better than hers, because she didn't need to, and he probably knew. She put her hand on the notebook she'd left on the table, the one with the arithmetic and the card from Henry and all the notes from the year, and she thought about putting it away. She had a shelf for finished things, but she left it where it was for now. There was still work to do. There was always still work to do. The civil proceedings in August, the ongoing question of whether the Garrity's would ever recover the 2 years of inflated fees, The school's maintenance fund that Dora had proposed and that needed to be structured correctly, the south field that needed refencing in the fall, the child who would arrive in October and change the arithmetic of everything in ways she couldn't fully anticipate. Life was like that. You solved one set of problems, and the next set was already there. Not maliciously, but just because that was the nature of a life that was actually being lived, that had moving parts and real stakes and outcomes that were never guaranteed. She looked at Rhett across the table. He was reading Brant's note, a small line between his brows that appeared when he was concentrating. She had learned to read his face the way she'd learned to read the weather here. Not perfectly, but well enough. He looked up and caught her looking, and the small line went away. "What?" he said. "Nothing," she said. "I was just thinking." "About what?" She considered the actual answer. She had been thinking about the spring dance, almost exactly a year ago, the first one she'd attended in Red Hollow, the way the room had shifted when Crow walked in, the 12 seconds she'd had to decide what to do, the voice from her left that had said, "She's with me." 3 words that had, as it turned out, changed the entire shape of everything. She had been thinking about how much had happened in a year. She had been thinking that the woman who had stood at that dance with a cup of cider she wasn't drinking, longing to belong to something and afraid of the cost of belonging, would not entirely recognize the person sitting at this table. Not because she had become someone different, but because she had become more fully herself. The fear was still there. The difficulty was still there. The imperfection was absolutely still there, in her and in him and in the town they had helped build and would keep building. But she was not furniture anymore. She was not a guest. "I was thinking about the dance," she said. He looked at her. Something settled in his expression, the way things settled when they found the right place. "That was a long year," he said. "Yes," she said. It was. She looked out the south window at the pasture and the mountains beyond it, still carrying the last of the winter snow at the peaks, the long light of June reaching all the way to the highest rock. A hard country, an honest one. The kind of place that asked everything of you and gave back exactly what you put in. Not more, but not less. She picked up her coffee. She was home.